Veterans in Service to Your Organization, Debunking the Myths About Wounded Warriors. Just a couple of housekeeping things that we'd like to discuss with you before the session begins. Like Nikki had said before, the phones are muted. We have over 145 participants registered for this webinar, and so we keep the phones muted so that your listening will be as undistracted as possible. But what we love is to have chats going on between our participants to find out what's going on in your world and to be able to answer any of your questions. So the chat feature is on the right side of the panel, and we'd love for you to type in questions either to all participants or to one of the presenters themselves to ask a question. We've got 3 presenters with us today, so we'll try to keep the session real tight and lively and keep the questions to the end, but if we see something pop up that needs to be answered, we'll stop our presenters and ask the question in the middle. We've also registered all the questions you've put on your registration list, so we'll ask those at the end as well. And I believe with that said, we will hand the phone off to Kobe Langley right now for him to give us the greeting from the Corporation for National and Community Service. Thanks, Kobe.
Thanks, Debbie. Thanks, everybody, and particularly Education Northwest for hosting this. I want to give a special thanks to the Department of Defense and Department of Labor for providing their subject matter expertise to this very important issue. The Corporation for National Community Service is a federal agency that provides grants to nonprofit agencies and organizations, as well as state entities and organizations. We push out just shy of about $1 billion a year to those organizations, and in return for that federal investment, we receive back about $800 million in private matching funds, which results in approximately 76,000 AmeriCorps members, full-time AmeriCorps members working with those organizations nationwide, and over 300,000 senior corps members working with those organizations nationwide. By person, we're actually the second largest federal agency in terms of the number of bodies that are supported through our appropriations, but we have one of the smallest federal budgets, and that's pretty typical of the organization in that we value collaboration opportunities, and we seek ways to expand our network of support, because at the end of the day, our ability to impact any kind of change in the social service arena is dependent upon the local connections. Some of the issues and challenges with having a very decentralized approach, to providing services in this way is, quite frankly, that we have a large number of individuals and that run our programs, and they're in a lot of different locations. So having webinars is a fantastic way to reach all those individuals on the ground in their communities and provide them with important information. This webinar today is a part of our ongoing outreach efforts to provide information to our constituents, to our grantees, as well as to our members about emerging issues and challenges that we're currently facing in our program design around veterans and military families. More specifically, this initiative this webinar is designed to help reduce the stigma around employing and leveraging national service members who are veterans with disabilities. The corporation's goal in this space is pretty straightforward. My job here is to expand the number of national service opportunities that are available for all service members, to include disabled service members and veterans, and it's also to expand the programs and services that provide support to the disabled veteran community. It's important that a part of our initiative is to increase the awareness of the resources that are available, and the large number of our grantees working in this space are actually providing intermediary support between federal and state agencies and entities that have benefits and services for wounded, ill, and injured services. One of the key goals of this session is to help educate ourselves and help to educate our grantees and members about the unique challenges of disabled service members and veterans, as well as the unique opportunity that leveraging those disabled service members and veterans brings to any kind of grant program or volunteer service center. Next slide. Slide before that, please. So this list is kind of the genesis, the progenesis, if you will, of this webinar. We have a wonderful online community base called the Knowledge Network that connects a lot of our grantees to hold discussion groups. And what I did over the past month or so is kind of coalesced a lot of the comments in those sections around what I would call kind of the top 5 questions about post-traumatic stress and about serving the disabled veteran community and service member community writ large. And hopefully by the end of this briefing, everybody on the call will be better informed and better able to answer these 5 questions. And I'll let you guys read those. I won't read them to you. So this next slide, at the end of the day, we're going to receive a ton of information from these fantastic experts that we have at the Department of Defense and Department of Labor. But at the end of the day, I hope that people walk away with being armed with this information to better understand the disabled veteran and service member community. And hopefully you'll remember 3 of those individuals that are on this slide. The first one on your left is a gentleman by the name of Mike Brimmer. Mike Brimmer spent 3 years of his life seeking employment after he left active duty from a tour in Iraq in 2006. His wife was an AmeriCorps member. She suggested that he reach out and see if there was an opportunity for him to serve as an AmeriCorps member. He did that, and he wound up leading a fire team in the fire trails of Colorado. He served with the Bureau of Land Management through one of our grantees, the California Conservation Corps, or excuse me, Southwest Conservation Corps, for over a year. He led a team of fellow veterans as AmeriCorps members on those fire team trails. And at the end of his year in service, he wound up becoming employed by the Bureau of Land Management, and every single member of his team, his all-veteran member team, also received employment from the Bureau of Land Management. That's Mike's story of resiliency, being a wounded warrior. On the right, top right, you see a gentleman by the name of Tim Levitt. Tim Levitt was also in Iraq. He was injured post-traumatic stress disorder and suffered a TBI, relatively severe TBI, after his Humvee was exploded via an IED. He actually returned and joined an AmeriCorps program in Washington State, and eventually actually stood up the first ever Veterans Corps effort in 2009 that assists right now every single student veteran who's attending a public college or university in the state of Washington. The AmeriCorps program is located in all 32 college campuses in the state of Washington and served over 7,000 student veterans. And that's Tim Levitt's story of resiliency. In the bottom you have Bobby Davis, and Bobby Davis is a reservist, but she was also the spouse of a reservist, Army reservist, who was unfortunately killed in Iraq in 2004. Instead of what I would call succumbing to that tragedy, Bobby decided to dedicate her life to others through service. She volunteered for the American Legion Auxiliary and was a fundamental partner in standing up the first ever and actually the largest Veteran Corps effort funded through the Community Anti-Drug Coalition that's now placed over 70 AmeriCorps members with 70 different National Guard units around the country providing substance abuse counseling services to those National Guardsmen and reservists. And that's her story of resiliency. So at the end of the day, I hope everybody walks away from this with an abundant level of information about how disabled service members and veterans and military family members can serve as national service participants. But at the end of the day, it's about the people, and I hope that you also remember these personal stories of individuals that have already done this and will continue to do this and provide inspiration for all of us. So thank you again for being a part of this call, and we'll turn it over to Margie.
Great. Thank you so much, Kobe. We know that many of you work in programs that actually serve veterans and help them to get employment skills or to translate their veteran experience into the civilian workforce. We know that all of you hire staff to be on your programs, and we know that all of you as part of the National Service family are really trying to recruit and retain veterans as volunteers or members in your programs. So you're going to be, the things that you're hearing today, you're going to need to translate a little bit into your specific program need area. But the one thing that we really want all of you to leave with is the sense that even though service members can become wounded or ill or injured, the injuries don't prevent them from contributing to society and to serving. And in fact, as with our own experiences of trauma and illness, often it makes them stronger and more resilient, more determined, and more committed to serve. And if that's the only thing you leave this webinar with, then we will have been successful. So I'm going to ask, because Kobe talked about the questions that we're trying to answer through this webinar, we're going to consider those the learning goals or the outcomes that we wish you to have. And we'd like to just focus on the persons that we're looking at today. Can you go back a slide, please? Back one? Thank you. And what research has, nope, next one. Research has told us that the challenges to veterans' employment include the concern that they have about, the concern employers have about the impact of post-traumatic stress and traumatic brain injury on job performance, the cost of reasonable accommodation, and the lack of knowledge on how military skills translate into civilian jobs. So keep that in mind as we move through this presentation today. Thank you. Next slide. Next one. So our presenters today, we are really fortunate to have some outstanding individuals with us today representing the world of disability, veterans employment, and the world of wounded warriors. We have Tony Camilo with us, and Tony is with the Department of Labor with the Veterans Employment and Training Service, and Tony is the gentleman in the middle. We also have with us Ed Cody, who is a consultant who's doing work right now on the Wounded Warrior Project with the Office of the Secretary of Defense. Ed himself is a Vietnam vet and has been in the U.S. Army Reserves. And I should say that Tony has also been practicing law with the Air Force Judge Advocate General Corps, so he's a reservist in the Air Force. And then our third speaker today is Mike Reardon, and Mike works with the Department of Labor, and he works on the Office of Disability Employment Policy. So he really comes from that perspective. And I think what's important about having Mike with us is that it's a crossover from the world of veterans to the world of people with disabilities generally who are engaged in national service. So gentlemen, thank you so much for being with us today. I'd like to turn it over to Tony. Or is it Mike?
First, what we need to do, though, Margie, is we're going to pause the recording.
Okay.
Ed has been able to join us, and he's on the phone, so we're going to unmute.
We're much better looking and much younger than those pictures, so it's unfortunate you're not seeing that. For America's Heroes, the program that I'm about to talk about, I want to just very briefly give you an idea of the why of it before we go into the details. We at the Office of Disability Employment Policy, like many other federal agencies, wanted to do something to respond to the critical need of returning service members coming back from Iraq and Afghanistan with significant disabilities. And like most other agencies, we started by focusing on those with physical disabilities. We assisted our veterans program here at the Department of Labor as they ramped up a program called Real Lifelines, which provided direct assistance, employment assistance to the returning service member while they were still in the hospital, and tried to get them to start thinking about employment options. One of the things that we found is that was way too early, that the veteran was often in a state of shock. They didn't know how their family would even survive, let alone what their job is going to be in the next few months, let alone the next year. And so we thought that we basically were trying to assist too early, and so we had to assist in other ways. We also found that there were a lot of employers out there who were willing to walk the walk. They wanted to hire these brave men and women coming back who sacrificed for their country. But when it came to those with traumatic brain injuries and post-traumatic stress, they were hesitant. Not only employers who weren't used to hiring those men and women, but even federal defense contractors and other companies that had a long history of hiring people with disabilities and hiring veterans. They just didn't know what the impact of hiring these men and women would be on their coworkers and on their insurance company and on their budgets. And so we refocused our project to assist employers to bring back these men and women. And so that's what America's Heroes does. It provides a lot of support, a lot of technical assistance, a lot of information for employers to start addressing those issues. Not only employers who are willing to hire newly returning service members who are leaving the service for the first time and looking at civilian employment, but those coming back because they were guardsmen and reservists, they were going back to existing jobs, but now they were coming back with all these added complications. Next slide, please. One of the things that we found that works very much with employers and will work for you as well is to not emphasize the disability, not emphasize the fact that they have post-traumatic stress or post-traumatic stress disorder, but to emphasize that they come to the workplace with a lot of skills, a lot of commitment, really a can-do attitude that is pervasive in the military, and that are all things that benefit any employer. So it would benefit any employer to hire a veteran because you're getting thousands of dollars of free training from the federal government, and you're getting proven competence and proven ability to work under pressure, because there's no more pressure that you're ever going to face than being shot at. So if you can survive and thrive in that kind of experience, you can probably do okay at the workplace. And so that's what we're emphasizing. Second to that is we're saying, even though you're coming with all those skills, the fact that you might have a physical disability, the fact that you might have a psychological disability isn't going to be that much of a barrier. There are ways of dealing with it, and there are accommodations that can be provided. It's not expensive, et cetera. So the fact that you're hiring a veteran is far more important than the fact that you're hiring someone who may have some issues that they have to deal with. We also found that there is a real problem with those coming back who have defense background, and have only worked in the various service branches. They cannot translate what that means in the civilian world. So an MOS, which is in essence, certification that they receive in terms of this is the position that they can do, does not translate very well to the civilian world. So something like leadership. When a lot of companies use online application systems and they're looking for leadership, a lot of the military individuals coming back do not even think in those terms. Even if they've led a platoon, they don't think in terms of leadership. And so it's something that we're working on, and we're going to give you some tips at the end to how you can make that connection for them. Also, many returning service members are unsure about exposing their military history because of the stigma that Kobe had mentioned. We have a lot of examples of men and women, for instance, who want to keep their security clearance, not taking advantage of the various counseling opportunities that are available to them because they don't want to put those security clearances in jeopardy, which may mean $30,000 or $40,000 per year for some people. Next slide, please. Okay, I want to very quickly give you a few figures just so you know the scale of this issue. There have been approximately 2 million soldiers and Marines who have gone to Afghanistan or Iraq and have returned. Of those more than 2 million, we have more than 36,000 with significant physical injuries, including 1,600 with lost limbs, several hundred completely blind, many thousands with impaired visions, 177,000 with some degree of significant hearing loss. For those with post-traumatic stress disorder, and real quickly, post-traumatic stress is not a legal term. It is not a medical diagnosis. Post-traumatic stress disorder is, and thus far of the veterans returning, we have about 250,000 returning service members who actually have the post-traumatic stress disorder diagnosis. So for those with that diagnosis, approximately 20%, which is in this case about 328,000, have been either diagnosed with PTSD or likely have PTSD but just haven't shown up at the VA hospitals. The estimates range for anywhere from 18 to 30% of the total population of men and women deployed. For traumatic brain injury, the estimates range from 15 to 23% of the total. The most often figure given is 19%, so that, again, that's 311,600 men and women with that diagnosis of traumatic brain injury. However, with traumatic brain injury, only 4 to 9% are in the non-mild range, in the significant range, that are going to last a long time. But again, you're still talking 82,000 men and women there, so the numbers are very large. Not only the returning service members, but the families as well. We have approximately 2 million children of returning service members that are going to be affected because these men and women are coming back with injuries, either physical injuries or psychological injuries. Next slide, please. Okay, and again, it's not PTS or PTSD is not necessarily just limited to those, obviously, with who have done service and have been in combat zones. There are a lot of individuals involved in the 9/11 attacks who have PTSD diagnoses. There are a lot of first responders, for instance, who are dealing with this issue on an ongoing basis. So for the employer, this is something that they deal with anyway, that they have men and women who work for them, regardless of whether or not they're veterans who have these issues. And so if it helps veterans, it'll help their other staff members as well. Next slide. All right, what might that impact be? And it can be lots of things. I mean, during most of our work with employers, both from the federal government side and for the private employers, we've seen that it's most often manifest in grief, anxiety, anger, in some cases hyper-alertness, some cases irritability, maybe feeling vulnerable, frustration, muscle tension, etc. It very much is individualized. It depends on the individual. There's not a set manifestation of PTS. Just as there's not a set manifestation of PTS, there's not a set solution as well. So there are many companies out there that say to employers, you know, we can help you address this issue related to returning service members with PTS. And there'll be recommendations anywhere from removing the wires because they're afraid that that reminds returning service members of tripwires, or removing fans so that it doesn't remind returning service members of helicopters, et cetera. For the vast majority of returning service members, that's not the case at all. The employer has to talk to them about that. That's how those are most commonly addressed, and that's how. Next slide. Again, what we found is that most employers, in terms of myths, they believe that all traumatic brain injuries are severe because it sounds severe. Traumatic brain injury is severe, but again, more than 90% of TBIs are ameliorated within a year. They basically go away. It's a physical disability, but for the majority, it's not lasting, longer than a year. Veterans with post-traumatic stress are unstable and have violent outbursts in the workplace. Again, that's something that's more Hollywood or TV land than in reality. There is a little bit of truth to that, but not much. Job accommodations are complicated and expensive to implement. When an employer thinks about job accommodations, they think Stephen Hawking, and it's going to be very expensive and it's going to bankrupt them, particularly if they're smaller employers. We found that to not at all be the case, that we fund something called the Job Accommodations Network, which is a free service, both phone and online, that employers can access. And what we found, for those with physical disabilities, the average job accommodation cost about $500. And that cost, for the most part, is going down every year. It's not going up because of the advance of technology. For those with PTS, however, the costs are usually much lower because it's less a matter of buying things than it is of rearranging schedules and adding some flexibility in the workplace. And then lastly, that a big concern that employers have had is that hiring veterans come with complicated legal responsibilities in terms of ADA responsibilities. What can they ask? What can they not ask? Does this mean that a veteran has a job for life, that they can't fire them, all that type of thing? And so we'll get into that in a little detail. So next slide. And then what you all need are relatively simple, and you need to know the facts, basically. You need to know some of what Kobe had mentioned, what really is a misconception versus what is reality. And then you need to know how to assist, and that's what all three of us are going to give you today, are a number of resources that you can access after this webinar as the issue comes up. Next slide. All right, America's Heroes is AmericasHeroesNetwork.gov, and it has a lot of resources that, again, it's primarily geared toward employers, but others can use it as well. Whether you're a veteran, whether you're a family member, whether you're an employer, or whether you're a grantee like yourself, you could all benefit from that. But it's written to address the needs of employer specifically. all this information, the fact sheets, the success stories. There's an online training module for employers who would like to train their staff, and you get some type of junior ranger certificate at the end, that type of thing. It's all there for what the employer might need. The employer can use as much of it or as little of it as they'd like, but it's all free, and there's also a toll-free number that they can access there as well. Next slide. All right, some of the examples of the accommodations for traumatic brain injury that we've found. Again, it's not costly. Permit flexible scheduling. That's by far the biggest accommodation that employers provide for those men and women. Additional time, in some cases, to learn new responsibilities. Allow the use of supportive employment and job coaches for those really with more long-term issues related to TBI than short-term issues. But it's something that we found works, and it's also something that there is support out there for that we'll get to in a little bit. Provide for job sharing opportunities where you can. Encourage employers to use daily to-do lists. Again, for this population, that's particularly useful. Special calendar, asking a mentor to assist employees in determining goals and provide daily guidance. We have found that particularly works if the mentor happens to be another veteran, especially another veteran who was involved in a post-9/11 conflict. And again, verbally as well as written as well as verbal instructions that they can go back to on an ongoing basis. As you can see, none of those are expensive. Next slide. For those with post-traumatic stress, again, some of the same task lists, flexible scheduling, especially for counseling or going to the doctor, that type of thing. Stress management techniques, again, based not on what the employer feels is needed, but what the either the applicant or the employee needs. So, for instance, if they want to leave a meeting for a half an hour, give them that flexibility. You may not know the reason at that particular time, but if they have that flexibility to leave when they need to leave, then a lot of the complications and the frustrations that both the employer and the employee feel go away, as long as they have that flexibility. Soothing music, again, it depends totally on the employee, not on the employer. Let them sort of guide that for you. Next slide. All right, we've tried to put this all together for an employer in an Employer Toolkit. It's an online toolkit that we find works pretty well, and not just for those with PTS and TBI, and not just for those with physical disabilities that result from their combat, but for veterans as a whole. So if there's an employer out there who's interested in developing a recruitment strategy, there's a lot of information within the toolkit that they can do that. If they're not interested in the recruitment, but for instance they have a woman coming back who was a guardsman, for instance, going back to an existing job, and they want to find out what accommodations might be there available for them, or what strategies might work to reconfigure her workplace, they can just go to step 4, step 1, etc. They don't need to go through this entire process. So it's not a 1 step through 6. It might be just step 6. It might be just step 2. So as much as the employer needs and no more. That's, if you give the employer, one of the things we found, if you give the employer too much information, it's just as bad as not giving them anything. Okay, next, please. And next, additional resources. Again, I'm not going to go through next as well, please. All of these in detail. It's just for you to go back at your leisure later, but just to let you know that these resources are out there. This is the Job Accommodation Network. This is what I had mentioned earlier. It's a free service that our office funds. We actually have worked with them to make sure that they have included information specifically for this population. And so there's a segment of the technical assistance online that is related to America's Heroes at Work and related to those with post-traumatic stress disorder. There is also expertise in person. So there's an 800 number to call. So if an employer, you can be an individual, you could be a service agency, et cetera, you can still get technical assistance both online and in person, but if you're an employer, you get sent to the front of the line. but you can still get free assistance from them. And it's a great resource. It's a great resource. And so if there's one source I would encourage you to pursue as the need arises, that's it. Okay, next slide. Real quickly, I put this in here. This is a federal program out of the Department of Defense. It's called the CAP program. And the reason it might be of interest to you is that they provide free technology to those returning service members that can be used at the workplace. And so if there's a piece of equipment that's relatively expensive and they're still on active duty that they would need in order to be able to do their job well, they could get that through the CAP program and use it at their individual workplace. So that's just a resource to keep in mind. Next. The best one-stop shop for veterans information that I'm aware of is the National Resource Directory, this source, and it provides a lot of information on not only employment, but again, housing, transportation, et cetera, anything you would need to assist a returning service member, whether they're injured or not. There's some very specific information if you have a physical disability or psychological disability, but there's also information just if you are a veteran or a family member too. So that is a clearinghouse of a lot of information provided by the Department of Defense, by the Veterans Administration, by the Department of Labor, by Health and Human Services there. So that's probably the best one-stop shop in my opinion. Next slide. And that's just a little more detail about the National Service Directory and Resource Directory and what it provides and where the information is contained. And again, the last point is more important, includes information not just from the federal government, but from the private sector as well. There are a lot of veteran service organizations out there that do really good work and make a lot of very good connections, and they're all included in there. And it's constantly updated. Next slide. Vet Success, we had a couple of really good questions about how do you find veterans, and how can an employer find veterans, and how can a veteran find employers. They have providers of service in which an employer can post jobs and a veteran can post their resumes and make those connections there. So that's a very good resource for that. There are additional resources, just so you know, on the NRD site as well. A lot of job banks. There are a lot of entities out there that are trying to make those connections. RealWarriors.net, this is if you are interested in more specific information about PTS, for instance. This is funded by the Defense Center on Excellence for Psychological Health and Traumatic Brain Injury, and they keep up with the latest research and resources related to those, again, with PTSD or TBI. But that's less of a general resource than a specific resource. And then for those who are, again, the crosswalk between a military job title and a civilian job title and how those can translate, there's a very good crosswalk on ONET that if you just click in the MOS, which is the job title in the military world, it'll tell you what that means in the civilian world. So that's a very good resource for veterans. And then end real quickly with some other employment incentives that you might want to keep in mind in the future. All of these are available, if you go through the nrd.gov, but the Work Opportunity Tax Credit for some employers is a very good option, especially the smaller employers. There are special employment incentives, there's the VA non-paid work experience. One of the things that we found, real quickly, that works very well for these returning service members with PTS is some type of internship experience. We had received one of the questions about the VISTA year in service option, and that's actually something that, assuming the returning service member can afford to work on a voluntary basis for a year, does work very well. It boosts their resume by giving them real-world experience, but allows them to enter the civilian world on a less sort of formal, less sort of disruptive basis. We have found that that works very well. It also works well for employers who have internship programs. It's a good sort of orientation period, I suppose, for both the employer and for the returning service member. One of the things we found is that we had a lot of men and women coming back who had strong leadership opportunities and responsibilities within the Army and the Marines, coming back and getting a job, for instance, at Home Depot. And if you've led a platoon and then you go to Home Depot and you're stocking shelves, there's going to be a disconnect there. And so that's why there are a lot of failures. And so it's very important that there be time for a good match between the service member coming back and the job that they're coming back to. The Disabled Tax Credit and, again, VRNE, all of these resources are available on the NRD. Okay? I'm going to turn it over to Tony now, who's going to give you more detail about the role of our VETS program here at the Department of Labor.
Thanks, Mike, for that. Very informative, and in fact, I will be probably referencing a few of Mike's points in my presentation as well, because as Mike pointed out, we're closely aligned here in ODEP and VETS. Our offices are next door to each other. I'm going to start, if I may, though, there's a question that was probably directed to Mike, even though it's directed to me through the chat session about, and I'll let Mike pipe in here if he wants to. Does America's Heroes at Work work with the ESGR, which is the Employer Support of the Guard and Reserve, and H2H, which is a program of the Army known as Heroes to Hire? Do you have anything to say about that, Mike?
Yeah, we work with both of those entities on a less formal basis than we did about 1.5 years ago. But yes, they are both partners. And I want to say also, all of the materials on America's Heroes at Work have been co-branded, co-written and co-branded by not only the Department of Labor, but by the Department of Defense, Veterans Affairs, and Health and Human Services. And so we work very closely with the Department of Defense, but also each of the service branches and each of the military support systems within the service branches.
Thanks, Mike. Okay, so I'm going to just try and get through my slides quickly here. I'm being told I should move quick, if I may. So let's move to the next slide. This is just a quick overview of what I intend to cover. Next slide, please. So a little bit about VETS. I don't know the nature of this audience that I'm briefing today as to how well you know VETS or understand VETS, but I wanted to touch briefly about what we are and what we do. You know, these are just some touch points about who we are, where we came from, that sort of thing, our genesis. I'd like the real important note here to take away is that the second to last bullet here is that we fund, that should be well over 2,700 positions spread across all 50 states, DC, Puerto Rico, and Guam. And those are the positions that are known as DVOPs and leavers, and that's a pretty common term in the veteran space, which stands for Disabled Veterans Outreach Program Specialist, or a leaver, which is a local veteran employment representative person. So those are the positions that we fund in the Department of Labor through VETS, through a grant. And I'll touch a little bit more on that later as to what that's about. But just the intent here is to show you that we actually are spread across the entire country in a lot of ways, and we have quite an extensive reach. So next slide, please. So a little bit more about VETS, what we do. Our P3 campaign, we call it here, to give you some background. So a lot of people in the veteran space have probably heard of what's known as TAP, which is the Transition Assistance Program. And what you may or may not know is that TAP is something that was created a long time ago to help service members transition out of the military and make their way into the civilian world. It was kind of, in the years past, it was much more of pro forma thing. People went through it. They didn't have to go through it. It was voluntary. And what's happened is there was a sense of Congress in 2011 that TAP really wasn't meeting its intent. So they amended the law in 2011, and now it's mandatory. The Secretary of Defense, you have to get actually a waiver from the Secretary of Defense if you don't want to go through TAP. So it's a pretty hard standard to get a waiver. So now TAP's been made mandatory for everybody, and more importantly, it's been redesigned. It's been much more redesigned to be focused on the modern day work era, whereas in the years past it really didn't keep up with the time. So now one of the nice benefits of TAP is that the Department of Labor funds a 3-day employment workshop within the TAP curriculum, and that curriculum now, we have a private contractor that works for the Department of Labor that is in the space of developing this sort of curriculum to prepare people. So kind of like a coach, if you will, if you were to get a coach to help you transition from one job to another. it's coached on a larger scale, but it's still the idea is that we have people that are experts in this space, providing and teaching the TAP curriculum across the entire United States and, in fact, some sites overseas. And it's much more nimble now. As the workplace changes, and the workplace is always changing, the TAP curriculum, we have the ability to make it more nimble and change with the times. So that's the intent behind it. The second piece of what we primarily do here in VETS is we provide our veterans employment placement assistance through the American Job Centers Network, and that's going back to those DVOTs and levers. Each of those DVOTs and levers sits inside of what's known as a state workforce agency, and every state has a state workforce agency of locations throughout their state that helps them helps people find jobs, and of course that workforce agency is open to every citizen of that state to utilize. But what's key is that the veterans get priority of service. So if you're a veteran and you need help trying to you need employment placement assistance, and you go into an American Job Center, also known as a Career One-Stop Center, in years past, before a law passed about less than 10 years ago, prior to that law, everybody who went in was just sort of treated on the same level of service. It was kind of first come, first serve. The law was changed about 10 years ago to give priority of service to veterans in those one-stop centers. So that's part of the provide piece of our campaign here. And then the protect piece is really focused on, we help enforce a law called the Uniform Services Employment Rights and Reemployment Rights Act, or also known in parlance as USERRA. And so if somebody thinks that their employment rights have been violated in some degree, they can file a complaint with the Veterans Employment Training Service, and we carry out those investigations. And then if we think that there's a substantial case out there, we refer those cases to the Department of Justice to get enforced. So that's the third part of our campaign, the protect portion. So moving on, next slide, please. What I wanted to do here is, and these next slides will go really quick, is what I wanted to do was kind of give this audience a little bit of data about veterans. And so all this data is coming from our sister agency here in the Department of Labor, the Bureau of Labor Statistics. So wanted to kind of educate the audience and I apologize if the audience is very thoroughly educated in this, but in order to figure out how to best leverage and find veterans and know more about veterans, I'm a big fan of data. And so I like to start by looking at what does the data show us. So here's what I call veterans data point one. And as you can see here, most veterans are men in the veterans category space, but if you look at the second bar chart, which are Gulf War era II veterans, and that's really, that time period begins with the post 9/11 era, you can see the numbers have changed dramatically, or changing dramatically, and a lot more females are in the space serving. Next slide. And data point two here, even despite the fact we have more women coming into the veteran space, the general population of veterans tend to be older overall. And so the way the Bureau of Labor Statistics divides up the data, or divides up the group of veterans, is sort of by period of service. And you can see there are a huge chunk of the veterans that exist in the United States are still in the World War II, Korea, Vietnam era veterans. But you know, there's certainly plenty of other veterans that are not in that older generation still out there, and I would submit to you that some of the most, even though our younger veterans seem to be the most at risk right now, there's also, I would submit to you that the data does show that some of our older veterans are also greatly at risk, especially in the space of homeless veterans. We have some data that you'll see here later on that talks about homeless veterans, and a good chunk of the homeless veterans data we're seeing out there shows that a lot of those homeless veterans out there fall within this 51% group, which is our older generation of veterans. So next slide, please. This is the third data point I wanted to show, is that you know, there's a lot of talk about veteran unemployment, and you know, and of course you see it in the news a lot, in the media sources. You also hear about it from members of Congress. And everyone's out there and wants to make a dent in the veterans' unemployment rate, but what people need to consider, understand overall, is that overall veteran unemployment is similar to the general population. That doesn't mean that it's good, because the unemployment rate for the general population is unfortunately pretty bad at the same time. But you know, generally speaking, overall unemployment rates for veterans is on par with the general population. Next slide, please. Now, as you start to take that data and you slice it and dice it up a little bit more, what you'll see is that the male unemployment rate, you can see there, male veterans versus non-veterans is very comparable in every age category except the younger generation. And our 18 to 24-year-old cohort is really probably the one that's getting the most hit by the latest decline in the economic circumstances in the country. So you know, this slide shows you that the male veterans are suffering in the younger cohort. And next slide. And unfortunately, it's even worse for the young female veterans. This to me is a very telling piece of data. Our young female veterans are really struggling with unemployment right now. Now, this isn't telling you necessarily why that is, why that data is the way it is, or what's the source of it. But the data at least shows that we have an unemployment problem. And I believe that I just saw here in the chat board that somebody posted that Syracuse University is following this data. And in fact, Syracuse is a good partner here with VETS, and they have done some excellent analytical review of that data to try and at least get a better understanding why the unemployment rate is so high for those younger cohorts. And so it's a good idea, and I appreciate Laura putting that out there so that people can review that. Next slide. Another data point for you to consider when you're trying to understand veterans, their background and where they serve, where they live, and what they're like, is to know that veterans tend to actually be more educated than the average American. So you can see here, just looking at the first two bar charts, veterans compared to non-veterans, pretty comparable in the college degree world, but when you look at, there's more veterans that have at least started college or have knocked out an associate's degree, and more veterans who, a higher rate of graduation from high school, and a lower rate of veterans who are not high school graduates. So again, just more data to consider if you're trying to understand the group you're trying to target and recruit in some way, shape, or form. Next slide. So this piece of data shows you a little bit about where veterans tend to work compared to non-veterans, and it's pretty telling here that you can see that the fourth line down shows veterans have a much higher representation in the career fields of production, transportation, material moving. So, and that ties in with what we know about a huge skill set that veterans learn in the military is logistics, and the ability to move large groups of people, materials, or resources from point A to point B. And so, it's not surprising to see this data show up the way it is. On the other hand, you look at that data and you can see that veterans don't tend to be as highly representative as the general population in things like sales and office jobs. And that's consistent with what we know about veterans and service members, is that large majority of the workforce in the military is doing that sort of on-the-ground blue-collar type work, much less so in the office environment. Next slide, please. And finally, this is the last data point that I wanted to share and discuss. You can see here veterans tend to work much more for governments, especially disabled veterans. If you look at that chart, the third one, disabled veterans are as high as 40% of disabled veterans that the Bureau of Labor Statistics is able to capture data on tend to work for governments across the federal, state, and local government. Much higher percentage when you look at non-veterans there. But veterans generally tend to prefer to work for the governments for some reason, shape, or form. And it could be because there's a lot of synergy between the military and the federal government, obviously, because the military is part of the federal government. It could be that they like the structure of government work as opposed to going in and being an entrepreneur or other career fields. There's a lot of explanations for it, but this is just some data points for you to consider. So next slide, please. So you're probably wondering, and I think I saw here when I was preparing for this, that some questions about, where are the veterans? Where do we find them? How do we connect with them? So if we can move on to the next slide. There's data out there to show this. There's a lot of data that can show you, we know where the veterans are, and you can see this is pretty recent by fiscal year 12. This is data that the Department of Veterans Affairs is able to populate for us, and you can see the largest concentrations are in California, Texas, Florida, and Pennsylvania. Next slide. And really, from your perspective, if you're trying to get more granular about the data, I'm happy to report that the Department of Veterans Affairs has actually looked at this from a county standpoint, and you can see, you can find, even within California, you can find, for example, much more heavy concentration of veterans near the large population centers like LA and San Diego, as opposed to the Inland Empire area, you know, or the more desolate parts of California. So the point I'm trying to make in all this is that if you're trying to figure out where the veterans are, if you're trying to connect with that audience, there are data tools out there to help you get there. Next slide. And despite the last two slides, what this chart will show you is, or not chart, but what this image will show you is that veterans, even though those veterans are highestly concentrated in California and Texas and those other states, lately, between 2000 and 2012, they seem to be flocking much more to, for example, Virginia, Georgia, South Carolina, and Idaho, surprisingly. Next slide. And this map here is something that I thought was significant to share with you, especially that because I know the CNCS does a lot of grant work in serving the veteran communities, and one of the most endangered veteran communities is homeless veterans. So what I wanted to share with you is to show you where the data shows that the highest concentration of homeless veterans happens to be in the country. Not surprisingly, it's consistent with what we know about where veterans are just located generally. It's California, it's your Texas, it's your Florida. But there's a lot of other states where the percentage of homeless veterans is pretty significant there. But the real large ones are those three states in California, Texas, and Florida, just by looking at this data. Next slide. That same Department of Veterans, the Department of Veterans Affairs conducted a survey, and it's funny because Mike had touched on this on his presentation, is that, you know, what are the challenges that employers face? And so this survey really focused on partnering with private sector human resources and talent scouts to find out what their perceptions were, both positive and negative, about recruiting recently separated service members. And here were sort of the buzz phrases that came out of that study. So you can see that while they see that veterans provide leadership, they have work ethic, they're reliable, there's these negative stereotypes or attributes that come with the idea of hiring a veteran. So you can certainly understand and appreciate why veterans are sometimes reluctant to express or share that they are veterans. Next slide. As part of that study also, the Department of Veterans Affairs also tried to find out a little bit more about recently separated service members, how they look for jobs, and this is just a kind of a gee whiz piece of data that showed that veterans are very engaged with the internet. They're using it very much to try and find jobs, to try and connect with other veterans perhaps, but most importantly to try and find employment opportunities in some way, shape, or form. So I just wanted to share that. That study also found this as well. Next slide. And this is something that we pulled from Monster. Monster did something they call a talent index, and they do this every year. And you can certainly find it on their website. It's pretty good data that Monster is able to pull here in their research shop. And what this slide is designed to show you is that here's what veterans, the industries they want to work in, and here are the types of jobs that veterans are interested in working in. And you know, not surprisingly, it sort of reinforces what the data showed earlier. They want to stay somehow in that government construct or that paradigm of work, but the highest type of work they're interested in doing seems to be in the IT fields. Next slide. And then finally here, I'm going to conclude on this slide is some resources to help, and I want to talk a little bit about each of these here. And I put the word "some resources to help" because I think Mike alluded to this. Oh gosh, Debbie has sent out a note saying we have to hurry up here. Okay, well, all I'll say here about some resources here is that, you know, there's no shortage of people in this space trying to do good things. And so I just wanted to highlight some of the resources that we here at VETS are working very closely with, and I'll talk very briefly about one or two of them. In every state in the United States, the Veterans Employment Training Service has a state director. And so that person has a staff of people that work for him or her who are very, very engaged and connected with all of the veteran groups within that state. And so I highly endorse or encourage you to reach out to your vet state director and to try and work with them and to seek out their help if you're trying to get more granular and talk to veterans groups in the state, or if you're trying to find veterans, whether it is for employment opportunities or even for volunteer opportunities. Our state directors are kind of the folks who have their ear to the ground in that state and know where the pockets of veterans are and where the veterans who are looking for opportunities, what they're looking for and where they're at. Another thing I wanted to talk about here is that Mike alluded to the veteran service organizations. What you may or may not know is the Department of Veterans Affairs puts together a very nice compilation of almost every VSO out there. And it's a linkage there to a directory that's online where you can find out where veteran service organizations are and how to connect with them. Because these groups, I can't think of a better source actually than these groups that if you really want to get down to the most local of local levels. While we have people in every state, our folks tend to be connected more with the state resources, but I can guarantee you that the American Legion or the VFW has folks in local local towns and boroughs in those states that can really help find and connect you with the veterans they know in those really small granular locations that are looking for jobs or looking for volunteer opportunities. So if you're trying to connect with that group, the VSOs are a great resource, and then of course I mentioned some other ones, the America's Here's at Work. Can't help but put a plug in for that. It's an excellent resource. The NRD that Mike talked about. And the Chamber of Commerce is really doing some great work out there. They're doing these huge job fairs across the country that are being very highly attended. And so I would recommend all of you that if you want to try and connect with veterans, the veterans themselves, they're going to these job fairs, obviously, because they're interested in looking for jobs. And a lot of employers are there, but it wouldn't hurt for maybe you to pop in if your organization is also looking to recruit. That's about all I've got, and at that point, I know I'm well over my time probably, so I'm going to turn it over to Ed Cody from the Department of Defense. Thank you very much.
Tony, thank you. Good day, everyone. I'll try to cover my slides quickly and make up some time here. I appreciate the opportunity to speak with all of you today about what the Warrior Care Policy Office within the Office of the Secretary of Defense is doing to increase education and employment opportunities for our wounded, ill, and injured recovering service members. Next chart, please. This is the mission statement of the Office of Warrior Care Policy. I'll give you a sec to read that. The Wounded Warrior
Hello, we're going to unmute all the phones. We may have lost Ed, and we'll see if he's on another phone line that's muted. Hello, Ed, are you on there? It looks like we've lost Ed for a second. We're going to mute the phones again until he shows up, and we'll ask Tony and Mike to answer a couple of your questions that you had. So in just a second, Nikki will have that unmuted. We'll answer a couple of your questions from Tony and Mike, and I think the first one that we had in our chat panel was, Mike, you had some stats on slide 12, and one of our participants asked, are these stats mutually inclusive? For example, people diagnosed with PTSD and TBI.
Sorry, were they mutually? So yes, the vast majority of people with significant physical disabilities, for instance, also have PTS. So, for instance, you can't sort of step on a landmine and lose your leg and not have post-traumatic stress, and so there's overlap there. So the statistics that show, for instance, 328,000, et cetera, with PTS, they would also include those with physical disabilities as well, yes.
Thank you. Another of our participants asked, could either of you please elaborate on vets shielding themselves from classification in referencing to a job?
Yeah, I mean, from prospect, like an ADA issue, I mean, that's a good question because a lot of employers have that concern. Like, for instance, what can they ask an applicant that's returning from Iraq and Afghanistan? Can they ask whether they have PTS? Can they ask, you know, what their involvement was in the war to try to get us that information? And the short answer is no, they can't. What you can do for all of your employees is to say, are there things that I could provide in the office that would help you be more productive? And you could probably get at some of that information there. So, but can you ask, for instance, whether an individual has a diagnosis of PTS? No, not legally.
All righty, thank you. Another one that came up during your session, Mike, and I think it was sort of between the transition between you and Tony, is can we utilize the programs that you talked about if we are just providing an internship program and do not plan to hire into a permanent position?
Absolutely, yes.
Great, thank you. Tony, you also mentioned some of the websites, and I think you did as well, Mike. One of our participants asked, do the websites have regional affiliates?
Well, this is Tony. I think that when you mean regional affiliates, you mean are there people actually physically located in these regions that are working on these particular programs? If that's the question.
Oops, sorry. Yes, I was going to say, I think they're hoping to find people that could help them in their area and region.
You know, I can't speak for the other departments, you know, the VA and DOD, although I imagine they very much do. I can say that for vets, we have like I said, we have state directors in every state, and then those state directors are actually oversee a staff in their state. And they're very closely aligned with all of the state workforce agencies in that state, the offices, which are usually quite numerous in each state. And that's where the DevOps and the levers that I discussed or talked about, that's where those folks work. So the answer ultimately is yes.
Great. I think, too, if folks look through their slideshow, the last of Ed's presentation has some slides about regional, yes, Nikki's going through them for us, the regional offices for education and employment initiatives, and that shows some of the regional coordinators around the area that folks can get into contact with as well.
And again, if you go to the NRD site, it'll give you all those local agents from VA, from DOL, from even in the recovery care coordinators, for instance, for the Department of Defense. That is, we strongly recommend you do that because they're going to have the best information about what is available locally. We can't we can provide the service here at the federal government, but we can't tell you whether there's a waiting list, you know, what the likelihood of getting in, that type of thing. That's all local.
Thank you. Another one for Tony, where can they find the data and the maps to get specifics for their counties?
For the counties, I got that from the Department of Veteran Affairs. They have a statistical analysis division, and that's where they compile that data. I believe the chart itself, or the map itself, had mentions that in the bottom left or right-hand corner. I can't remember. But certainly you're welcome to share that, what I provided there with the attendees.
Great, and what I'll try to do is enlarge that map big enough, and I'll put that information on the edited chat that we put on the Knowledge Network.
Yeah, I see you just changed the slides there. So that's the National Center for Veterans Analysis and Statistics, which is part of the Department of Veterans Affairs. They have an office of the actuary, and that's where they work. So it's compiled here at headquarters for Veterans Affairs, but it's you know, they have, I believe, a very heavy, strong balance of statisticians that work there to collect this information.
Great, thank you. One of our questions from the participants before they logged in was, what is the greatest hurdle for returning veterans to overcome?
I think Kobe sort of hit the nail on the head, which is the societal and employer misperceptions and misconceptions about what that might mean. So if you have a returning service member with a physical disability, is it going to cost me a lot of money? If you have a returning service member with a psychological disability, is it going to affect the workplace in significant ways? And that's what they have to face. And a large part of what we've done is change our focus from technical assistance to almost an anti-stigma campaign itself. So America's Heroes at Work is trying to assure the employer, comfort the employer to know that if their office isn't going to blow up, they'll still get a lot of productivity out of their other employees as well as their new employee.
Thank you. We are going to take one other question from our folks from the registration. One of them was, what are some creative strategies used to accommodate individuals with a disability? Are there any resources you can point me towards? What are some ways to engage veterans who have been out of work for an extended period? Do you have anything additional, Mike or Tony, that you want to add from your speech?
For the former part of that question, for sure, it's the Job Accommodations Network, JAN, which is on the site. That's by far the best single source of information related to accommodations, where to find them, what the legal requirements are, where you can also find some assistance to help pay for that. So that's the best single source. For a veteran who's been out for quite a while, that's a tough one.
Well, this is Tony. I think that for helping a veteran who's been out of the work world a while, and so this is, there's an entire sort of bevy of things that need to happen in order for a veteran to get back to work. Maybe he's been out of work for a while, and some of that's probably could be related to, could be psychological, but a lot of that's also getting their skill set up. And most veterans, not all, but most veterans are entitled to get some sort of assistance with that skills sort of, call it updating, or that skills refreshing through the Department of Veterans Affairs. They have what are called rehabilitation and employment counselors, and it's a lot like case management work, where folks can sit down with you, get an assessment as to what your skills are, and then be able to provide you with an idea of where you need to get your skills in order to become gainfully employed. So that, to me, that's probably the best source or the best way for let's say a lengthy unemployed veteran to get back into the workforce. The other side of it is they can also go to their state workforce agency and if they're disabled in some way, shape, or form, our disabled veteran outreach program specialists also do that work similarly, as long as there's a focus just towards employment and not a medical component to it, because our DVOPs are not really trained so much in the world of healthcare and dealing with accommodations. What they're really focused on is getting a disabled veteran back up to speed and back into the work world.
Alrighty, thank you so much for answering those questions for us. Ed is back on the line, so we will let Ed finish up with his part of the presentation and then return to some of your questions. Thank you.
Debbie, can you hear me well?
Yes, we can. Thank you, Ed.
Okay, so on this chart, I'm not sure exactly where I was when we were disconnected. So basically, the Wounded Warrior Education and Employment Initiative, referred to as E2I, started about 2 years ago. It's a DoD initiative to ensure consistent offerings to all recovering service members by synchronizing, integrating, and expanding the available education and employment opportunities to service members before they become veterans. So this chart shows the various activities that the office provides: recovery care coordination program, transition policy for the disability evaluation systems involved in programs and budget, the financing of the office, and external outreach activities. So the Education and Employment Initiative exists within the Recovery Coordination Program along with something called Operation Warfighter, which is a DoD-sponsored federal internship program allowing recovering service members when they're ready to and it's been approved by their medical caregivers to actually go out and do some work in a federal agency while they're recovering. And then there's the Military Adaptive Sports Program, which is an effort to increase a service member's well-being through sports activities. The Education and Employment Initiative is a collaborative effort led by DoD with support from federal agencies and non-federal entities to address the synchronization and integration of and possible expansion of existing education and employment support efforts for recovering service members to improve their career readiness and facilitate employment placements prior to separation. It's important to note here that, you know, we work with the active duty service members, and subsequently when they're separated, we work with the organization that Tony was mentioning, the DVOPs and the Levers, connecting them to those assets around the country. Next chart, please. So the resources that are available to a wounded, ill, or injured recovering service member are varied and can come from a number of sources. Certainly, family members are the most important in the recovery process, and additional support is provided by a host of caregivers who are concerned with a service member's medical, psychological, and administrative well-being. So the E2I initiative and Operation Warfighter are activities that are related to employment readiness, as noted at the bottom of this chart. Several community groups have asked how they might support recovering service members or their families while they're on active duty or after they separate and become a veteran. And as noted on the right-hand side of this chart, those areas would involve things such as housing, transportation, finances, spiritual matters. They all become very important when a service member returns to his or her community. Next chart, please. Our initiative operates out of 9 regions currently, and we will soon add a 10th region. I'm responsible for the National Capital Region, but I collaborate with my colleagues around the country who are also working with various employers, educational institutions, and community and veteran support organizations. For the most part, if a service member wants to pursue education, certification, or apprentice-type training programs, there doesn't appear to be a shortage of supportive organizations around the country. The challenge continues to be matching the wounded, ill, or injured recovering service member to career-oriented jobs, and here's the kicker, at their intended place of residence. When a soldier, sailor, airman, Marine wants to go home after their recovery, their job skill set may not match the available job opportunities in their community. Many colleagues, or my colleagues and I have been working with federal agencies and private sector organizations, as well as with various community-based organizations, for example, the USO and the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, to expand the number of employment opportunities for these service members and trying to find a good fit for them when they head home. Next chart, please. From the perspective of a wounded, ill, or injured recovering service member, I think it's useful to understand something about the process that they must go through. There's a lot of detail on this chart, and I sort of want to just keep it simple and focus on a couple of points that are relevant to this discussion. While it's important to recognize the sacrifices made by many individual service members in their combat deployments, there were other service members who, for example, are injured in training or diagnosed with an illness. I had one young man who had a liver transplant. All are going through essentially the same process, which will help them to recover and be either returned to duty or to be reintegrated within the community. I've been told that the average period of time for this transition process is 400 days. And clearly, the initial focus is on their medical recovery. However, once an individual has been identified as ready to participate in education or employment opportunities, They're given an assessment, they develop a plan, and then they prepare for the next phase in their career. And that preparation can include going to school, pursuing certification, participating in Operation Warfighter, non-paid federal internships. But nominally, when recovering service members within about 90 days of separation, their focus should be on securing a career-oriented job, and I underscore career-oriented, or moving forward with their educational goals. So our initiative helps them to maintain that focus, as we do not want members of this disabled population to separate and return home with nothing to do. And for the most part, the service members we're working with will be at least 30% disabled. Once a service member is separated and receives his DD-214, their certificate of release or discharge from active duty, they're eligible for the services from the DBOPs and leavers that Tony mentioned and from the Veterans Administration's Vocational Rehabilitation and Employment Organization. Let's go to the next chart. This map shows how we've broken out the 10 regions for the E2I initiative and for our Operation Warfighter folks who are co-located with us. While the obvious question would be that that breakout by geography doesn't appear to be very equal, it's actually based on an analysis of the number of recovering service members at the various warrior transition units throughout the nation. To the extent that the community and volunteer service organizations have identified potential employment opportunities for disabled service members, then the appropriate personnel to reach out to would be my E2I counterparts and I around the country. And so their contact information is provided on that map for your use. So in closing, I'd like to mention that should disabled service members return to your communities without a career-oriented job, there could be a number of actions that community-based groups could undertake to assist them with employment that will give them an opportunity to earn an income as they reintegrate into the civilian job market. Each of you has a network that can be utilized collaboratively to find opportunities not solely for the recovering service member, but also for their spouses and members of their family. So sorry I got dropped off there, but I look forward to your questions. Over to you, Debbie.
Thanks so much, Ed and Tony and Mike. We are going to hand it over to Margie right now for a quick wrap-up of what she's heard from today's presentation, and then we will do some closing remarks and last-minute things, and we want to thank you all for hanging in here with us for this last few minutes. And just a few minutes more, and we'll be on our way. Thanks. Margie?
Great. Thank you so much, Debbie. This has been a very, very rich discussion, and I know I've learned a lot. A couple of things that I'd like to just pull up right now. Basically, some of these we know. All veterans are not the same. There are different eras, different genders, different levels of education among the veteran population, and all veterans with disabilities are not the same either. And as a result, we need to speak with the individual, find out what kinds of things that they might need, what might work for them, so that they can do their job in the way that they need to. We can't ask if someone has any kind of a disability. We know that from our work in national service. We can ask if people need any kind of special services or accommodations. And then, unlike the myth that it costs a lot to accommodate, most of the accommodations are around scheduling or things that are cost-free or low cost. There's a difference between PTS and PTSD, and post-traumatic stress is really a normal reaction to an abnormal situation, and it can fade or go away over time. PTSD, on the other hand, is a diagnosis, and it's something that would require professional help. Again, one size doesn't fit all. It's going to vary from individual to individual, how it impacts them and the accommodations they need. It's important to keep in mind that the highest unemployment rates among veterans are within the post-9/11 group, and particularly among women vets. There are many, many resources available to us, both nationally and at the state and local level, and it's more a matter of finding out where they are and trying to coordinate them. Some of the ones that were highlighted today, which I think are really worth mentioning again, are the National Resource Directory, ONET, which helps to crosswalk the military skills with civilian skills, and the Job Accommodation Network. Finally, it's really important to remember that service members sometimes become wounded, ill, or injured, but the injuries don't prevent them from contributing to society and continuing to serve either in an internship or as a national service member or a volunteer before they actually move into the employment world. It's often the experience that they've had that's made them more resilient, more determined, and more committed to serve. Thank you.
Thank you, Margie, very much. Since we are close to being on an hour and a half now, we want to close the session with just a few more words. We want to thank everybody for the rich chat that's been going on today. We are going to share all that information and put the edited chat in an email to all of the participants, as well as put it here on the Veterans and Military Families Knowledge Network. The Knowledge Network will have a copy of the recording, a transcript, the PowerPoints, and the chat as well. So you'll be able to find all those resources there. Also, what we would like you to remember is part 2 of this webinar will be going on March 19th. We'll take a stab at the myths, and the 2 presenters will be providing specific strategies that you can use within your organizations for helping you find ways to put these great professionals to work in your organization and as volunteers and members. Also, we would like to let you know that if we've got some additional questions that weren't answered in this chat today, we'll forward them to the presenters for part 2 and also provide them to the presenters from today and see if we can get some answers and provide them in our edited chat as well. Thank you so much. We've got an evaluation form for you that will pop up right after the webinar closes, and we hope you will give us feedback, because everything we can do to make these webinars better for you, we would love to do. And with that, I think we will close and say goodbye. Thank you very much to our presenters today, and we hope to see you again on March 19th. Bye-bye, everyone. We have one dead weight.